Hi there, my name is Luke Meddings, and welcome to the second in a series of 3 masterclasses for gallery teachers. In the series, we're looking at modeling Unplugged, the idea of that being that we're interested in how to shape the space in our classroom practice. And I'm particularly interested in this session in looking at how we can blend unplugged and non-linear work with the linear syllabus that most of us have to follow. So let's get started and let's look at how we can think about shaping the space in our classrooms so that we can fulfill our own responsibilities to the learners while also following that syllabus. The name of the whole series is Lines and Paths, Circles and Spheres. And I'm going to review the work we did last time, exploring lines and paths, before thinking about how we can open the space so that instead of being a single linear experience for ourselves and our students, we have a more dynamic experience of the time that we share with our students. So part 2, circles. I said we'd review, and I'm going to give you in this session an activity which will help you explore the key ideas behind Teaching Unplugged. And those, as we saw last time, are that it's conversation driven. And by conversation these days, it might be conversation using a mobile phone. It's materials light, it's not materials free, and we're focused on emergent language. So last time we looked at linear teaching and at 3 elements in particular, which I would say that most linear teaching approaches have in common. One is that there's a lot of top-down teaching. If the content comes from the coursebook, if the coursebook is linked to the syllabus, and if all that in turn links to an exam, which is going to test the students and to some extent the teachers on how well the syllabus has been learned, then a lot of the content is being delivered. The timing of linear lessons tends to be pretty precise, sometimes timed by the minute or the 2 minutes. And the lessons are planned carefully in advance so that we know in language teaching what exponents we're going to teach, and the stages and the tasks and the activities that we're going to use to try not just to exemplify and teach those exponents, but to bring them to life in a more productive way. We know this as English language teachers as PPP. Pretty much, that's how a PPP lesson is characterized. Unplugged teaching reverses the top-down and the planned elements. If we're listening to what our learners want to say and how they're saying it, if we're allowing into the classroom themes that interest them, things that are on their mind that day, and if we're then following those themes and interests from day to day, which can take the form of a kind of parallel syllabus, a self-generating syllabus that runs alongside the linear one, then by definition, a lot of that content is bottom-up. It's coming from the learners. It's coming from the interaction between the learners and the teacher. And it may well be that they start to create their own materials, their own artifacts, which bring that to life and which help us to record it. If we're listening to our learners' interests and language needs, if that's what we're attending to, then by definition, we won't know in advance exactly what's going to come up. And that means that instead of planning everything before the lesson, we need to take time after the lesson to record what's happened. I call it mapping here. I've also called it post-planning in the past, where we see what happened and then turn that into a record of the lesson, which we can then share with the learners in the next class. And the other thing to bear in mind, and the other thing that can be really difficult if we're trying to make space for more spontaneous interaction with the learners, is that our timings need to be flexible. So we need to find the space, and we need to kind of protect the space within our classrooms if we're going to get enough unplugged time. People have sometimes talked about dogma moments or unplugged moments in class, and I think those are great. But I think if you really want to pursue this idea, then you need to think how you can make moments into experiences and how you can build those experiences into every lesson. And like everything else, the more you do it, the easier it gets. So those are two models of two different kinds of teaching, a linear approach and a non-linear or unplugged approach. What really interests me today, after teaching and training for 10 years after Teaching Unplugged was published, is the idea of blended space. I know there are many contexts, not just in the UK, but around the world, where teachers are mandated, have to follow a course book, which follows the syllabus and which then leads to exams. Exams are often the kind of monster on the horizon, which makes us nervous as teachers of departing from the course book. But I believe it's possible to blend these approaches so that, in effect, two things are happening in our classrooms. We're possibly using a course book, which reflects a syllabus, which reflects a broader curriculum, which leads to an exam. But we're also making the most of all the opportunities to build up from unplugged moments, from things that people have said, from references that they've made to what's in their lives, what's happening in the outside world, to listening to the language that comes out of that, and then to mapping that language on a daily basis. So that as well as following the course book, we're also kind of following our learners and playing their language back to them. And this generates from class to class. We looked at this image in the first session. It's a picture of the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. And I started thinking about how the roads, the highways, represent something like the objectives and the outcomes that we set and expect as educators. But in the middle of that space in the foreground, we can see many desire paths. These are unofficial, informal roads that people have made simply by walking in the direction they want to walk over the years. And this represents not just the built environment around it, but a sort of informal feedback. This is where people naturally walk. This is the direction that people naturally want to go in. And as you can see, it's not completely random. It forms its own informal map. It doesn't look that different to a street map, and it's happening in parallel with the highways around it. And I invited you to focus on especially that space in terms of paying attention to what learners want to talk about, what they're interested in, giving them the chance to make that the content of at least part of the lesson, and then listening to the language that they use to express their thoughts and feelings. One of the other things we talked about last week was this process whereby, when using language naturally, when not just being set on that highway, on that road of exponents and outputs, the linear approach, we can really hear what's going on with learners' language, and we can hear how they think in language. And I think two things, many interesting things, but two in particular come out of that. One is the realization that, of course, as we know from our daily experience as teachers, what we taught yesterday hasn't necessarily been learned by today. What we taught last month or even last year isn't necessarily readily available to the learners. So there's a kind of slipping back that we can observe as learners misuse, if you like, language that the curriculum suggests they should already know. But there's something else that happens, which is as learners express their thought freely, because we're not just telling them to get on the road and follow that path and use those particular defined language exponents. We find them using a much wider range of forms and vocabulary than they otherwise would. And of course, because they're learners, they don't know all of this perfectly. And so two things are happening. While we find them and observe them slipping back and making mistakes with language that they, in theory, have already learned, certainly already been exposed to, certainly already had explained to them, we also find them reaching for language that they perhaps haven't yet been taught, haven't yet been exposed to fully, and which they will inevitably get wrong. It's really important to remember that when we hear people speaking in another language, that there's another language at the back of their minds which they know how to speak perfectly, and there may be more than one. So people know that that language is available from their first language when they try and express complex thought. And when they reach for it in English, they're telling us something about their needs at that moment. They're setting their own path. And I believe that as teachers, we should really pay attention to that and facilitate the directions that they want to go in, and not just keep shepherding them back to the highways and the roads. So here's the last slide that I'm going to review from the last session that we did together. And the idea of this is, and it leads directly into what we're going to be talking about today, is that we can't set the parameters or the boundaries of interactive activities too tightly in the classroom. If we really want an activity to be communicative, we can't control it, and we can't say that you must use these words and you must use these verb forms. That makes it stressful for everyone. And it's why I believe that the final P in the PPP methodology, that final phase in the lesson, is often frustrating for teachers and for learners, because it's really hard to kind of fit a particular set of language exponents or a particular verb form into what's supposed to be a free activity, a communicative activity. So the thought here is to leave the gate open and see where the language goes and follow it there. I mentioned last time a couple of activities that I really like. They're really activity types, and I want to review those today so that you can try them out in class. There are loads of these activities in the book, Teaching Unplugged. When I run workshops, when I teach groups of students, one of my favorite activities to start with, and then you can vary it week by week, is to ask a really simple question that you know everyone's going to be able to answer. And the croissant is there in the center of the screen because one of my favorites is simply, what did you have for breakfast? Or, depending on the time of day, what's the nicest thing you've had to eat or drink in the last 24 hours? I mentioned that last time, and I'm mentioning it again because I want to think a little bit more about why it's such a great activity. You can organize it however you like. You can set up the theme. What did you have for breakfast? Find out from a partner, share with a smaller group, and then feed back to the class. You get people up on their feet asking each other what they had for breakfast, or that other question I suggested, what's the best thing you had to eat or drink in the last 24 hours? So you can set it up in the class however you like, and that will allow you to navigate smaller or larger groups. The reason why it works is that everybody can answer it. You're not putting anyone under pressure, because even if you didn't have breakfast, there'll be a reason for it that you can share. Although I would say be careful if you're teaching in an environment where some children won't have had breakfast because their parents don't give it to them because they don't have the money. But generally speaking, people can answer that question. You're not making it a stressful start to the activity. So it's something that people can genuinely find out, and there's a genuine information gap there because they don't know what the people around them have just eaten or ate yesterday or whatever. The other reason I love this activity and why it works so well is that a whole range of a language emerges from it. Now, if you were approaching this task from a PPP perspective, you might ask yourself, okay, how do people talk about what they had for breakfast? They'll probably use past simple verb, what did you have? So let's make that the grammar focus. And we can expect them to use a certain range of vocabulary for foodstuffs, let's say, depending on which country you're in or what region you're in, who the students are, how old they are, whether they're kids at school, people who are working, etc. So if you like, you could do it that way. You could predict and ask them to use a verb form. You could teach or display or review and ask them to use a certain group of words. But I'm suggesting we do neither of those things. I'm suggesting that the activity itself is enough, provided it's clear to the students and they can all access it and get started and get involved. Then listen to the language. You could get groups in threes and have one person, or larger groups, and have one person making a note of the language that they hear. That can work as you become accustomed to this and as your students become accustomed to this kind of activity in class. So what kind of stuff emerges? The thing is, you really won't know until you hear that conversation, which is what makes it so exciting for you as a teacher and so motivating for the students. Generally speaking, people might start, or they might mention what they did have for breakfast, but they'll quickly start using, for example, other verb forms. They'll say, I had a croissant for breakfast because I know I'm going to have a big lunch, because usually I don't have time. And then in one sentence there, you've got three verb forms. It might be challenging, but this is how we think. This is how we use language in real life. The verb forms come together. You might expect them to limit their conversation at first to what they ate. Very quickly, you'll find out that they talk about other things. Essentially, the places they were when they ate it, the people they were with, their usual routine, and possibly pleasures or anxieties that are associated with breakfast and food and routine in general. Somebody might say, I only had this because I'm on a diet. Somebody might say, I had this because it's my birthday and it's my treat. And suddenly other dimensions open up, which you can then return to and discuss, provided, of course, that the students want to discuss it. But in general, we're quite interested in ourselves. And given the opportunity to talk about ourselves, we very often take it. So, of course, be sensitive, but also kind of trust the process. As people realize that they're welcome to talk about their own lives, they'll generally do it a little bit more. And the level of interest you show and the level of sensitivity you show, if people are struggling with anything, is what's going to maintain the balance and make the most of it all. So I recommend you try this activity. It could be, what did you have for breakfast? It could be, what's the nicest thing you've had over the last 24 hours? Something to eat or something to drink. And you can tell them it could be something as simple as a glass of water because you were very thirsty. It doesn't have to have been a fancy meal. And then just listen to the conversations, move around the room, sit at the different groups as they talk and make little notes. Your decision then is what language to focus on now and what to save up for later. If, for example, you recognize that people are making the same kind of mistake or trying to use the same kind of expression or form, then that could be something to teach right now, to remind them of how to use that form or to expose them to a new word or phrase. If there's a variety of outputs coming up, you can save your language analysis for after the lesson and come back to them with your feedback the next day. So what I'm essentially saying is that the very simplest means can produce the most varied results. And I think by contrast, sometimes the most complex sequences of tasks and activities in a course book produce rather limited means. The language we get out of it is a bit thin and disappointing. Here's an example, and again, I'm reviewing something we talked about last week, as well as introducing something new, of teaching using limited materials. We've never said don't use any materials. Materials are great. The closer they're linked to the interests of the students, the better. The fresher they are, the better. So if you find something interesting and can bring it into the class the next day or the next week, if your students can be encouraged to do the same and bring in something which interests them, then you can start to build from that. Sometimes it can be a really small physical object. In this slide, you can see on the left a sachet of sugar. It's from Brazil, and it's got a little motto on it in Portuguese. So what I want to show you here is that a small piece of physical stimulus, and this was just grabbed from a cafe, including, not English actually, although you've got the word premium there, which is a shared word, but you've got a phrase there in Portuguese. So your material, in other words, can come from your environment, even if you're not in a mainly English-speaking country or region. Because what you can do there is then ask your students, well, how would you say this in English? Let's all try that. And in their attempts to translate even a short phrase, you'll get small levels of variation. You'll get different ideas. What is that object on the left? As I said, it's a sachet of sugar. And I picked up on this as a material to use in teacher training when I was in Brazil, because sugar is one of the main products in Brazil. It's closely linked to the country's history. But it's also linked to lots of other things. And so when I gave every group or every trainee in the session a sachet of sugar and asked them to try and develop a classroom task from it, we got all sorts of different ideas. Sugar might link, in fact, to many different places in the syllabus, in our coursebook. It might link to work on health. It might link to a unit on what you eat and drink. And at the same time, other elements might come out of it when you ask people to find their own way with it. And again, I'd invite you to think of how you could use that in a classroom. If you were able to give everyone in the class the same piece of physical stimulus, it could be a small coin, it could be a piece of sugar, it could be something natural, it could be a leaf or a flower from outside, and then give them a choice of routes into the material. Remember last time we talked about the McDonald's activity in the conversation after the presentation, and I'm reviewing it for you here. It's a grid which allows 4 ways into a subject. So let's imagine that you'd given everyone this sachet of sugar, or something that was closely linked to culture in your city or your country, or something that was common to everyone. And then you want them to find their own way into it, to get a bigger range of possible outputs as you can. Then giving them a choice is a great way to do that. So describe the object. Not that easy to describe a sachet of sugar. If you don't know the word sachet, you're going to be looking for packet, and you can help learners there. They might describe the colors. You don't know what they're going to describe until they start trying to do it. What about a memory associated with sugar or with a sachet of sugar? Is it something you associate with going to a cafe with people when you were younger or something like that? How about an opinion? Last 2 weeks ago, we talked about McDonald's. But in this case, sugar. People might have quite different feelings and opinions about it. They might think that it's an unhealthy element in our diets and that companies shouldn't be using it in their products. Other people might feel that it gives us pleasure. It's something that's nice if we don't have it too much. And the final of these 4 choices on my napkin activity is to actually make something out of the napkin. That might be a little harder with a sachet of sugar, but do something physical with it. Just maybe describe the sound it makes when you shake it. Pour it out on a piece of paper, make a pattern in the sugar. Give students the chance to kind of find their way into language via action. So that's an example of using realia, using something that you've found in the environment, something which might have language that isn't even in English, as a way into the class. It's so interesting to see how students try and work something that's written in their own language into English. Both the activities that I've talked about, the idea of asking a very simple everyday question and then listening to what comes out of it, and giving people a bit of guidance around how they might talk about or write about or think about a physical object. In both cases, although the activity is carefully considered, we haven't decided what language we want to get out of it. Instead, we're thinking, what language can we get out of it? What language is going to emerge? And then we respond to that. And we don't have to respond to it all at once. It's not possible. We can respond to things that we're confident or comfortable responding to in the moment. And then we can do our own kind of homework between the classes, which is part of our own teacher development, which we should be doing anyway, and come back to them the next day. I mentioned in the breakfast activity how people might quickly use or try to use a number of verb forms. So if the question was, what did you have for breakfast? And the answer was, I had a croissant because I'm so busy these days, but I'm going to have a big meal at lunchtime. And suddenly you've got all that happening. You're not alone here because you do have a syllabus, you probably have a course book, and there's the curriculum. If you don't have any of those, there's a grammar book. There are always places where you can find reference points for the language that emerges in class. So don't feel that you're stuck. Don't feel under too much pressure. Although I think, as we said last time, it's good to feel alive in the classroom, and sometimes feeling alive involves a certain amount of uncertainty, feeling a little confusion ourselves as teachers, like, where am I going to take this? What's the best way to use this language that has come up and which the learners have generated naturally in teaching? So that's all about emergent language. And emergent language comes when you have activities which are conversation driven and which are materials light. And as I've said, they relate to the syllabus. So with that packet of sugar, although I wasn't telling people how to talk about it or what themes to explore, themes naturally come up, which you can expect to be able to link maybe to a unit you've taught or one that you're going to teach later. This is a rather poetic analogy, I think, for the syllabus, but I think it might be a useful one. Years ago, I was in a bookshop and I found what they call a crumpled map. That's how they market it. A crumpled map of Paris. When I was looking online for illustrations, I found this one of the Spanish island of Mallorca. It looks a bit like a bunch of flowers. I think it's rather beautiful. It's emerging from the packet. And what I like about this crumpled map is that it kind of softens the linearity of maps. Now, when we're given a map, or when we find a map to help us navigate around somewhere, it might very often be on our phones these days. We might be given a map if we stay in a hotel or something like that, and we want to figure out where we go in a city. The map kind of tells us all the available places, all the available routes, but it doesn't tell us which one to take, and it doesn't tell us which places to go to. And I think that's a useful way to think about the syllabus. If there was a syllabus printed on fabric that we could kind of fold up, put in our pockets, and then take out and refer to as needed in the classroom, I think that would be a great product for teachers. Maybe we should work on it together. But it's a way of getting away from this idea of I'm here today and I need to be here tomorrow. Or as you plan a lesson, I'm here at 11 o'clock and I need to be here at 2 minutes past 11, here at 5 minutes past, here at 10 minutes past. Where's the space for the communication that is actually the whole purpose of language teaching? The whole idea of language teaching is that we prepare students to be able to speak, that we prepare students to be able to communicate, that we prepare students increasingly for communicating in a world of culture, a world of work, where they're going to encounter English at one point or another, whether it's in a business meeting or whether it's in a piece of music or a movie or a game. The whole point of what we're doing is to give students the tools that are going to allow them to communicate. And if our teaching is too static, if it's too linear, if it's too controlled and too controlling, then we're not going to give them those real life moments where suddenly they need 3 verb forms to express a single thought. Now, it sounds complex and it sounds challenging, but as I said earlier, like anything, it gets easier the more you do it. And you'll never know unless you try. It's like getting a bit fitter as we start to walk or run or cycle. Little by little, it gets easier. So, what I'm suggesting is that we see the syllabus as a resource that's available to us, as well as something that we may need to follow. And that establishes a dynamic between linear teaching and unplugged or non-linear teaching. So that, yes, we are following the syllabus that we're given, probably leading to the exam that the learners are going to take. But we're also taking the opportunity to make space for unplugged moments, for spontaneous moments, and then building them into experiences, building them into a routine, building them into a teaching and learning practice, which we become accustomed to and which becomes easier for both teachers and students the more we do it. And I just want to think finally about the idea of, I guess, leading and controlling. Often this is expressed at an early stage in our thinking about a lesson in the lesson plan, where we try and imagine exactly what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and then kind of make sure it happens. That's where the planning comes in. As I said last time, there are things we do in life where we're teaching, where we're helping someone to do something they don't know how to do, where there isn't a plan, where we simply have to follow how that person is getting on. If we're teaching a child to ride a bike, for example, we don't have a lesson plan with us or a bicycle plan. We just kind of encourage them, see what they can do that day, see what they can do the next day. Let's think about learning to drive. I don't know how you learnt to drive. I remember having lessons from my dad. And when I was getting those lessons, he would take me to a car park. He would take me to an empty car park. And the reason he took me to an empty car park is that he knew that I couldn't drive. He knew that he wouldn't be in control of the car. And he knew that I wasn't going to hit any other cars. But I could very slowly and gently get accustomed to moving the car around. Now that's fine. And it was great. They were great mini lessons. But of course, it doesn't prepare you for the road, which is why most of us, when we learn to drive, pay for an instructor. And the instructor has a different kind of car with what we call dual controls, double control, so that if there's an emergency, they can stop the car or they can adjust the steering. Why do we need that? We need it because on the road, there are so many variables. There are things that we don't expect. There are things that we suddenly experience on our own driving, which we don't quite know how to control. We're going too fast. We don't know how to take a corner. And most of all, there are other cars doing all kinds of things that we haven't yet encountered. You can't learn to drive without going onto the road. And the reason we usually get an instructor is because they can make it safe for us. Can't learn to drive in a car park. You can learn to kind of move around and make small movements. The analogy here is we can't learn to communicate if all our activities are tiny boxes and if all our activities are designed to get us practicing a single verb form or a small group of words. We have to allow our students out onto the roads as we teach. We have to give them activities where they can use language freely, and we have to attend to the language that comes out, listen for those sliding backs, look at where they're reaching forward for something they don't yet know how to use, and then help them navigate that experience. Here's a last thought I want to leave you with, and it's about the idea of controlling or accepting that we can't control things all the time, or perhaps we shouldn't try to control them all the time. Here's an example of a really beautiful playground slide. It's been beautifully designed. It's designed in a wave. It's a great color. It's got kind of organic shapes in it. And yet look at what the kids are doing. They're sliding away from the machinery, if you like. They're having more fun diving down headfirst away from the slide and climbing up between the slides, going down on the back sides on the other side, than they would if they were sliding down, or at least they need to do both. And there are some adults in the picture who are kind of thinking, I don't know, is this right? Should I be putting my child on the slide because that's where they're supposed to go? That's the experience that's being designed. It's going to be a bit of both. But again, I guess I'm using that analogy of childhood learning experiences and play to show that we can't control everything. We need to follow what the learner wants to do. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a great way to teach. There may be times where we need to take control, where we need to be more didactic, but there are many occasions where we can listen, sit back, take note, encourage, and then shape the experience into a learning experience afterwards. Finally, do take a look on the Gallery Teachers website for more ELT resources. If you're looking for more reading, more workshops to support your professional development, it's a great place to go. And the more you look at, the more you try. So take a look at Gallery Teachers.